All right. I think it's working. Okay, so we'll jump in here. You are welcome to share as much as you would like. Give a quick introduction of yourself and who you are, name, pronouns, position, and share about your background and history in the work you do, connected to social justice in your community, explore identity, and yeah, I'm excited to hear what you say.
For sure, man. Well, thank you for having me. My name is TimHernandez. And I am always very honest with the place that I come from. I'm from a neighborhood called the North Side of Denver, Colorado. But my story starts a little bit before I landed in the North Side. I was actually born in Pueblo, Colorado, in a little government project called Dog Patch on the east side. And following that, after my mother passed, I went through a variety of things. I bounced around the foster care system with my brother, all over the place, lived in Denver, Colorado Springs, Fountain, all over the place until I was adopted by my biological aunt and uncle who were Northside Denver Chicanos. And so I, lived with them. I ended up living with my aunt and my uncle, my adopted father. And I was adopted when I was 12 years old. And I really just grew up in a very unique way. I kind of grew up with a very close proximity to school by consequence of it was the only consistent thing that I ever really experienced as a child, right? Like, especially up until I was about 14, 15. I'd lived in all kinds of houses. I lived with Black people, white people, whatever it is. I lived with a lot of different type of people. I went to 9 schools by the time I graduated high school. And so it was a really unique schooling experience because I got to understand that the adults in my life were very temporal. And because of that, I was able to very deeply dive into my relationships with my teachers, and I was able to use that in a very effective way to excel academically, right? And be able to put myself in different positions. So from there, I graduated. I didn't go to North. I grew up 2 blocks from North, but I didn't go to North for reasons that a lot of people don't send their kids to North in my community, right? Like North about 15 years ago, 10 years ago was known as a very just not a great school to be a part of. There was a lot of gang affiliation that people were worried about. There was a lot of violence that people were talking about. And although I lived there, right, and that was something that, like, I was very comfortable with the people that I lived around. My family wanted to send me to a charter school, so my family actually sent me to Pinnacle High School, which is on 84th and Huron. And Pinnacle is it's like the way that I heard somebody describe it, it's like a kind of like a privatized healthcare for Latino education, right? Like, doesn't actually solve the problem. It just like puts everybody, the same group of people, in a very different circumstance with the same results, right? So I went to a school that was 99% Latino students, with 1 Latino teacher that I ever had. And so I grew up with a really kind of challenging relationship with my racial identity. Anybody who grows up in a Latinx community, Chicano community, will tell you about these like cultural competitions that we have with each other, and who's more Mexicano and who has more, and kind of the difficult realities that exist there. And then we can bleed in the nuances of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity that are present in those conversations too. And so it was something that I went to college at the University of Northern Colorado. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was a first-gen student. And I had no fucking idea what I was doing. Oh, I don't know if I can cuss on here. I cuss all the time, bro. I no fucking idea what I was doing. And I'm always very honest with my time at UNC. It was my first ever interaction really intimately with a predominantly white environment. I grew up right with Latino and Black people. Like the center of my world was not whiteness. And so the like proximity that I was then imposed upon me going to a predominantly white institution was really overwhelming. And so I went to UNC, and it was there that I was able to really kind of thoroughly understand my own like racial identity, ethnic history, right, and stuff like that, and start to put myself in positions that I think really kind of set the foundation. So while I was at UNC, I was able to explore and take classes, ethnic studies classes, Mexican American studies classes, Chicano studies classes, Africana studies, and really more deeply understand like racialized history and what that means. And I did that because UNC actually has like a really, really unique BIPOC community, right? UNC has more students of color than any other college in the state. right? Even though we're a tiny college, it's 13,000, right? 16,000 if you count online students. At UNC, 40% of us were students, or not 40, excuse me, 33% of us were students of color. And so we actually had like a really big influence on our campus. We had a big, identity on our campus. And it was something that we had a really unique community because of that, right? UNC also is 55%, 58% first generation students. So there's a lot of low income kids, a lot of Pell Grant kids, a lot of free and reduced lunch kids, right? A lot of BIPOC people. And so I got to go to college in a community of people that, although we were all experiencing the kind of the woes of a predominantly white environment, like we're able to build a community with each other and really deeply support each other and love each other. And so I always say I have such a deep reverence and love for the community at UNC and in Greeley. And that's why I really kind of branched off into everything I was going to do, right? Everybody always asks me why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because quite literally, I was the first person in my family to go to college. So I didn't know you could study anything other than English, math, history, or science, right? Like I didn't know that was a thing. And I was always a good writer. And so I did well in English. So I literally became an English teacher because it was my best subject. And I thought I wanted to be a teacher. And so I was always involved with teaching circles and stuff like that. But it was, a couple key events at UNC that really put me in a different trajectory. One was Donald Trump came and spoke on our campus 2 weeks before the election in 2016, which, I was involved with some of the resistance that happened to that, stuff like that. We won't go into details, but, it was a really clear opportunity for me to understand. And then, after Donald Trump wins the election in 2017, he's sworn into office. And one of the first things he rescinds is the DACA program. And so in 2017 in September, he announces he's going to rescind the DACA program. And I decided that I didn't agree with it. And so me and my boss, who is a undocumented professional at UNC who ran multicultural outreach and recruitment, which is what I was a part of to recruit more BIPOC students to UNC. We decided to organize a rally, and we thought 50 people would come. And in 7 days, we got about 2,000 people to come out and walk around the streets in Greeley, right? Greeley, people don't know Greeley is like you're from Wyoming, right? Like Greeley, Weld County as a county is so conservative, it voted to secede from the state of Colorado. Like it's hard to do stuff like that. And so to have so many people come out and make a very clear stance was really powerful for our community. And I was really honored because I'd never done organizing, never thought of protesting. Like I was raised, my mom was deeply involved with Chicano politics in Denver. She was part of the Circle of Latina Leadership under Federico Peña. But and I had been exposed really early on to kind of like independent political ideology, right? Like I went to these conferences that are called the La Raza Youth Leadership Conference. They're hosted by Servicio de la Raza. Rudy Gonzalez runs it. And basically they're institutes for young Latinx high school students to be able to interact with each other and think independently. And so I had heard about the Chicano movement. My mom was involved in it. My mom actually made me go to the conference, right? And I was involved with stuff like that, but it was right after I had organized that I started to get more involved in the community. So I started taking Mexican American studies classes, really deeply understanding stuff like that. And I decided to run for student body president. And I became the first Latinx student body president in the history of UNC. And so from there, I was did a lot of political things involved with there, right? The infrastructure of Weld County is very localized. So I was involved, I was at state of the city addresses, right? And city council stuff. And so I was very deeply involved in a political sphere that I had no idea I would be involved with, especially with administrative politics at a university. And I'll be fucking honest with you, bro, it was really hard, right? Like, because I was in these upper echelons of whiteness and tables I didn't even know existed, and trying to navigate them and be authentic. And like, I really went through some difficult experiences there. But right after I finished my term there, I was set to student teach, and I chose to student teach at George Washington High School in Denver Public Schools because I knew I wanted to be a public school teacher. And I basically gave myself that semester to understand if I wanted to be a teacher. And the following semester, I was going to try politics. And so I did that, student taught there. And then immediately after that, I got an internship in Congress, and I was an intern for Senator Schumer, who at the time was the minority leader. And I worked on Donald Trump's first impeachment trial. I was there during the acquittal. And so I went from like this very like interesting reality and relationship to schooling in the world and society into like quite literally most powerful room, right? And sitting there and watching what happened. And then COVID hit, right? I was working on I was on the Capitol when COVID hit. So the Capitol was the first thing to shut down. And immediately after that, the nonprofit that brought me out there, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, they offered me a job running their high school leadership program. So I did that virtually for about a year, and I worked for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. I had 100 Latinx kids from across the country, and we did a 4-week leadership institute, and we, all kids from all different places, all different ethnicity, all different races, kids that speak Spanish, kids that speak 7 languages, right? Kids from who quite literally like were in Cirque du Soleil, like all kinds of Latinx kids. And so I got to lead them through some really dope leadership and educational training. And then I realized as I was in DC that like it was the most formative time in the history of the United States, right? Like I lived in DC during George Floyd, during the Black Lives Matter movement. And like it was then, because I had organized before, right? In Colorado, I had done DACA. When a CSU student, a white student, wore blackface, I had organized for that. I organized for all kinds of stuff in Colorado. And then it was being an anonymous protester in DC, right? And really sitting and learning and listening to Black organizers and really, not marching right on the weekends, but I'm talking like for like 9 weeks straight. And so it was something that was really formative to the way that I understood movement work, the way that I understand community change, the way that I understood the way that you activate communities towards change. And I decided that I really didn't give a fuck about anywhere else as much as I gave a fuck about the north side of Denver, right? So I decided to go back. And in January, I got a job at North High School. And I now teach at North High School. And I teach at North High School. And, I think a lot of people prescribe to me, and I'll finish up here because I know I'm giving you a long-winded answer. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Basically a lot of people impose like a pity upon why I teach at North and the reasons that I teach at North, and it's so great that you do that. And I think it's important to name that like it's actually very sacred to me. It's something that like I get to facilitate sacred knowledges for the students, and where we come from, right? I teach Latinx literature, I teach Latinx leadership, and I teach English 4, which is a senior English class. And so I literally get the job of facilitating the knowledge that, enlightened me and empowered me, and really built key tenets of my personality, key racial identities, ethnic identities, in me for the people from where I'm from, right? That live in the same city blocks, right? That like we go to the same restaurants and the same churches and the same, right? Like people that are my community. And so that's kind of my trajectory in the way that I've kind of lived life so far. So sorry to give you a long-winded answer, but yeah.
Not at all. That's great. That's great. And yeah, the testimonial is all about just diving in and not having as much of a back and forth. So you're doing great. You're doing great. And like I really super interested in that history. And it seems like you've had, quite a last couple of years. So that's really cool to hear. So let me have you explore a little bit. I heard some strands that I'm going to kind of pick out. A little bit of the idea of how, because we're hearing in the news this pushback about discussing race in school, this like, the critical race theory, faux controversy, fake controversy as far as I'm concerned, but like it's relevant right now. And you talked a lot about ethnic studies and how those were kind of formative to you, and that's kind of how you see your present work too. So just to maybe dive a little more into your opinion on, the current climate, the current controversy, and what it really means for the future of Latinx students, Black students, all students to learn about race in school.
Yeah, I'll be super short with this one, bro. I teach critical race theory. I absolutely do, right? I teach racialized history. I teach racialized experiences, racialized literature, right? And I teach my students to be critical of the racial histories that they're presented, right? And that means that I teach critical race theory, right? And that and I think, we get into these dog whistle situations, and trust, bro, I've worked in Congress, right? Like I literally know exactly how it works, right? About how political, schemes and mechanisms, are able to pundit language to us to be able to give us in essence, like what we want to talk about, right? Like And so it's interesting, I think. I think we also have to be very honest that like the pushback against critical race theory has everything to do with the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, right? Which means that, being against or being hesitant to critical race theory is anti-Black. And that's like, that's literally like the only way that I can view it, because I don't think that we would have reached a precipice with our racialized history if we weren't confronted with it in the way that we were in 2020, right? I think racialized history is the most important thing, because we talk about solidarity and all these like, how can white people can use their privilege and all these like, abstract concepts, but really what we're talking about is motherfucking people should be able to belong and feel that they belong. And the only way that we can ever connect people to each other is to connect them with themselves. And that means we have to understand our racialized histories. We have to understand our political histories, right? And I think a lot of teachers are afraid to come out and talk about politics in the classroom. Like, you can follow me on Twitter, bro, 100%, right? Like, teaching is inherently political. It does not exist as an apolitical function. The only reason that it would exist for an apolitical function is for the purposes of workforce training, right? Like to train you to do something else other than participate in society. But if education's job is to prepare you to participate in society, that is inherently political, because our society is political. And that means that like we also have to be honest with the ways that like people try to tell us what is political in education. All of a sudden, racial education, racialized history is a political topic in education, right? But we're not willing to unpack the political reasons of why schools today are more segregated than they were before the civil rights movement. We're not willing to inquire about the political reasons of why I quite literally have to have a community fridge to feed my kids in school, and Valor Christian High School has muscle milk as a sponsor, right? Like, I think we have to be very honest about why we take up the issues that we do, and really like what that does to the people that it's not me who's impacted, it's our students who are impacted, right? It was our students who came with questions about critical race theories, our students who came, asking questions about what do I do with this? What do I do with this? And I'll be honest with you, bro. I tell my kids, just like I tell everybody else, I don't exist to make white people comfortable. That's not the center of my universe. That's not what I'm going for. And I don't say shit to make white people comfortable. But that's something I was able to learn through my own racialized understandings of my history, right? I identify as a Chicano, which is a very unique term, right? It's unique because not only is it racial and ethnic, but it's also political. And, a lot of Latinx people may not identify as Chicanos anymore, or they've never identified as it, because Chicano is also a commitment to an anti-imperialist world, an anti-capitalist world, right? An idea of, building, when we look at the etymology of the reason why the word raza exists, viva la raza, right? The reason why we use that word raza was never intended, I in the way that I've read about it and talked to people like Dr. Falcon and people who built the Chicano movement, right? It was not necessarily about a racial experience, but a social experience, a social condition, right? Of poor people and working people and blue collar people, and yes, who are disproportionately people of color, right? But also being honest about the ways in which like our society exists to hurtfully create realities for people who are disadvantaged, right? I think we have to get out of this idea that fucking stratified systems are consequential. They're not, right? Like, they're not consequential, right? Like there's an exact reason why Tabor and Amendment 46 and the Gallagher Amendment, why all of these operating things in our state statutes in Colorado, why all of them manifest in a reality, why Cherry Creek gets $92 for every cent that goes to Cherry Creek Public Schools goes to the classroom. And in Denver Public Schools, 78% of every dollar, right? That's 20 cents for every dollar we get in educational funding. That means those are political reasons, right? Like why those things exist the way they do. It's not like education literally is not even in the Constitution, the word education. And that means that education literally only exists in the inherent realities and what state and local governments choose to do. Education is standardized to the way that it is because our states chose that and our national government affirmed that, right? That's what happened under the education reform movement that happened with Barack Obama, right? We can see the same thing when we look at disabled students, intellectually, social, emotional, physically, traumatic brain, whatever it is, right? And the No Child Left Behind Act in George W. Bush's presidency, right? And the failures that came from that are because we don't have an education system that is built to support the ways that politics actually matters, right? We're having conversations about everything. Everybody thinks they're entitled to an educational opinion about education because they were a student. right? That's fair. Everybody's entitled to an educational conversation about whatever they want. But when we're talking about racialized history in education, we have to be very honest about why that is a necessity, right? And it's a necessity because as of 2014, majority of public school students across the United States are students of color. Whereas in the same year, right, even 5 years after, in 2019, 80% of teachers across the United States are white. And even further than that, right, 40% of school districts across the United States do not have a single teacher of color. And that means that we have to be very honest about why racialized history is important. The majority of public schools in our country are made up by BIPOC people, racially, ethnically non-white people. And that means that we have to have a very honest conversation about the ways in which we would like to build a society for racially and ethnically non-white people, right? Like I tell people all the time, the average age of a Latino person in the United States is 11 years old. That's the average age. We're the largest racial minority, 18% of the US population right now, and we're only 11, right? That means 7 years from now, what does that mean for political power? 7 years from now, what does that mean for economic power? What is that, right? We're talking about Latino communities and why racialized education and why critical race theory and why all these things and political realities that manifest in an empowered BIPOC minority. Ethnic studies is the only solution to that because ethnic studies is the only one that inherently embraces the politics of education, right? That embraces the racialized history that is going to benefit literally the majority of students in our society. And that means that we have to have a very honest conversation about who are we building society for, right? People who are hesitant to critical race theory, we have to have a conversation of why are you hesitant for critical race theory in our schools? We can talk about white guilt and white shaming and all these other things, right? But at the end of the day, if your anti-racist work is sitting here more worried about how white people are going to grow in their understandings of whiteness than the dignity of life for BIPOC people, that's still white supremacy, right? That's still white supremacy. And that's in anti-racism. And so we have to be very honest about how we have those conversations. And ethnic studies is the only platform and discipline that I've ever encountered and practiced that actively centers BIPOC realities in the service of BIPOC empowerment for the exact purposes of creating a society that is affirming, empowering, and creates a sense of belonging for a racially and ethnically non-white people.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing answer. And so much complexity in what you're saying. And yeah, no, it's great. It's great. Just to continue down that road before we pivot to one more question, but to continue down that road, like, are there any events, movements, people that are particularly inspiring in that formative phase that you like to, present to your students, or that they may or may not be aware of? You talked a little bit about how the erasure of identity and how ethnic studies can reaffirm that and kind of give students a base to truly understand in a deeper way who they are. So I'm just worried about, or not worried, I'm just wondering about like key events for you or key people or.
Yeah, man. A lot of people, I'm always very honest, bro. Like as deep as and as deeply meaningful as the community work that I do now is, everything that I learned, everything that I am is because people invested in me, right? It was people like Dr. Dolores Guzman at UNC, Doctora Priscilla Falcon, right? Ex-wife, excuse me, of Ricardo Falcon, a Chicano martyr who was killed in New Mexico during the Chicano movement from Fort Lupton, Colorado, right? It was, Jerry Craver. It was, the chair of the English education department at UNC. It was so many people that invested in me and created realities that were conducive for me to be able to thrive, right? I think that's the conversation that we have to have. Is it's not about what is going to make our students thrive, but it's about what environments can we create that our students have the choice to thrive. How can we make thriving the easiest choice, right? Because every kid wants to thrive, right? Every kid. But they're born into social realities and going to schools that invest more in their failure than in their success, right? And so that choice to thrive becomes harder, right? It becomes harder when your teachers are fucking replaced every year. It becomes harder when you don't have adequate supplies. It becomes harder when you don't even have a ride to school in the first place. It becomes harder when you're hungry. It becomes harder when you don't have a place to sleep, right? Like that means that we have to be invested in the ideas of making thriving the easiest choice for our students, right? But the way that I formatively learned the way that we make the easiest choices is understanding the relevancy and necessity of choice in the first place, right? That liberation is not everybody out in the streets marching, right? Liberation is everybody thinking. And that means if everybody is thinking, then that means we can start to have conversations about what choices we would like to make, right? Because liberation, right? Like I think about when Jay-Z took the deal with the NFL, a lot of backlash that he got, right? Because Colin Kaepernick was ousted and Jay-Z comes in to like profit off of it, right? And I had some deep critiques as well. And I also think that it's important to understand that for BIPOC people, liberation is not about us all doing the same thing. Liberation is about choice and us having the available choices to be able to move in ways that help us make the choice to thrive for ourselves, right? That like, yeah, am I disappointed that Hove chose to do that, that Jay-Z chose to do that? Absolutely, bro. But am I upset that a Black man is getting paid? No, right? Like, and I think that's the way that we have to have conversations when it comes to BIPOC, understandings of liberation, choice, thriving, education, opportunity, right? Like all of the reason why all those things are abstract concepts is because we're not investing in the reality where we can make a choice towards that, right? Like every kid wants an opportunity. Every kid wants to thrive. Trust me, right? Like we made an entire book in my classroom of original photos of our community, original poems on Google Slides for free, right? Like there's ways that we have, genius in us, right? That are being taken out. And that means that we have to have active roles in investing in that, right? Like subtractive education. I don't know if you ever heard of this. Subtractive education is a very real concept, right? Subtractive education is the idea that you go to an educational system and you lose something, right? It's the reason why I have deep hesitations for culturally responsive education. I don't really agree with culturally responsive education because it affirms the idea that multiculturalism and education are separate, that culture is something to be responded to by education, right? When that's not sustainable, right? Culture is not a prop to be used for the purposes of education, right? Instead, I'm not interested in an education system that responds to the multicultural nature of our students. I'm interested in an education system that sustains the multicultural nature of our students, right? I'm not interested in culturally responsive education. I'm interested in culturally sustainable education. And I think that means that we have to move in ways that are inherently about choices, inherently about the ways that teachers can make choices and admin can make choices and students can make choices and communities can make choices and families can make choices, right? All of those choices combine and collectivize movements, right? I'm deeply inspired by the Chicano movement, right? I have like, I'll show you, like, I have an entire arm dedicated to it, right? About like what it means to my community, right? And La Raza Park being very sacred to me is something that I learned from my community, right? That the reason why pushing college education as the only way to succeed, the reason why, military recruitment exists in schools, the reason why all those things move and the way that they operate in an education system is because we don't value community knowledge outside of school as equal to or greater than what we teach, right? And that needs to be the way that we shift education, right? That your community knowledges, practices, cultural expressions, right? All of those ways of being, living, thinking, learning, right? All those ways are valid, bro. And they're powerful, right? Like they're superpowers. When we think about the ways that like BIPOC people have sustained across generations, right? Off of no resources, right? And we've still been able to, find whatever levels of success and cultural capital and political and economic capital we can, right? Like I deeply believe in the Chicano movement. I deeply believe in Chicano identity, mestizaje, right? And what all those things mean. I have deep critiques of them as well, right? Like deepest critique, the mestizo symbol tattooed on me, right? Like because I know what it means to my community and the mestizo identity of only being indigenous, colonizer, and us, right? Completely eradicates and erases Blackness. And where does Blackness fit into mestizaje identity, especially when we talk about the African slave trade that happened in Latin America, right? Brazil had more slaves than the United States, right? And that means that we have to understand Latinidad, mestizaje, right? Chicanx identity. The reason all these things, I believe in them deeply, I critique them deeply, and I think that they give us a model and a blueprint to be able to self-claim and create systems that work for us, right? Like I talk to my students all the time about the Black Panther Party, and imagine what the Black Panther Party could do with Black Lives Matter resources, right? Imagine, right? They already had schools. They already had a free lunch program that literally was bought out by the state of California and then distributed across the entire United States. That's why we have free and reduced lunch now, is because of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, right? Like, imagine what they could have done with resources. And what that means is that when we talk about movements and people and the ways that I was invested in, the ways that I was invested in is a direct result and an example of how we need to invest in other people, right? I came from a shitty background, but 100%, right? Like, grew up in ways that people wouldn't want to, right? Like foster care and abuse and all these other things. But I think it was so sacred to grow and understand our society and people that way, because it put me in a space where I can share it with other people, right? And that means that, like, I have a unique reality that I can invite other people to and to understand and do in empathetic ways. Now, does that mean that that's like absolutely the most important thing? Maybe not, right? But I'm on a tangent. I could feel it. But what I'm trying to say is that, like, all of the understandings that I was able to build in myself and celebrate of my experience, right? I spent a long time trying to be white, pretending to be white, talking white, acting white, dressing white, right? Like, trying to aspire to the idea of what I was told is a successful model in education, successful model of a person in our society, and especially how they interact with education, right? But more importantly, I did that because I thought it was the only way that I could succeed. And I think it's so important that when we talk about the ways in which I was taught to develop into the person that I am, the experiences, the way I learned from movements like Black Lives Matter, like the Chicano movement, like the Black Power movement, like the Palestinian movement, like the American Indian movement, right? The reasons why I learned so deeply from those things and the reasons why they taught me so much is because they are all interconnected in the idea of independence, right? They're connected in the idea of reclamation, and they're connected in the idea of empowering people for the sake of belonging in what is rightfully theirs, right? And I think that is where we need to have conversations. And I think I was given a unique opportunity in reality that, you know, made choices that I could make it there. That was only possible because of the BIPOC people that raised me and taught me, right? Like Quinteva Styles, I'm a member of a historically and predominantly Black fraternity. And Phi Beta Sigma, John Lewis was a member, Elijah Cummings was a member, Black Panther Party founder Huey Newton was a member, right? Like deep Black cultural icons. And I get to have proximity to that because of the ways that I understand and appreciate and celebrate Blackness, right? Because of the ways that I'm committed to Black liberation, just like I'm committed to mine, right? And I think that it means that we have to move in ways that are inherently integral and interconnected, right? That Maslow's hierarchy of needs be damned, right? Like the highest form of functioning is not independence, it is interdependence. And that means that we have to have a conversation about how we understand ourselves, about how we understand each other, and more importantly, about how we invest in each other towards that, right? Ricardo Falcón, he was killed in New Mexico on his way to the Raza Unida Party, which is an independent Chicano political party during the 1960s and 70s, was on his way to the conference from Fort Lupton as a speaker and a delegate, and he was murdered in Oro Grande, Mexico, New Mexico, by a white man who didn't face any charges. And he was acquitted on all accounts. And he has a quote that says, "We ought to get it on." And I think it's something that's really sacred and powerful to me, because in order to get it on, there's two things that have to happen. One, you have to give a fuck, right? And two, you have to be there, right? You have to be willing to go and embrace the realities that are different and hard and hurtful, right? To quote, you know, the goddess Angela Davis, right? The revolution is never going to happen in higher education. Revolution is not going to be led by academics. The revolution is going to happen in the hood. The revolution is going to happen in the barrio. And that means that we have to be very honest about the ways in which we celebrate that we incorporate and sustain that in education. And more important than anything, that we teach people and directly put resources towards people making choices towards that, right? Towards their own independence. Because I think that is the way that we start to build a society that functions in a way that is sustainable, in a way that is actually going to take brown and Black people, BIPOC people, and put them in spaces of power, and they're no longer being burnt out at the same rates, right? The reason why Black women are the most burnt out group in all of Denver public schools as teachers is because it's not because of the students. I might be because of the workload, but I guarantee you a moving factor within that is the pervasiveness of whiteness within education. And that means that we have to be very, very honest and very, very clear that I'm not interested in performing in a white education system. I'm interested in performing in a community. right? I'm interested in going to my community and sitting with them and listening and learning from them and creating curriculum in my school that reflects that, right? I'm interested in going and listening and talking to people that might be in my community, Black people who are in my community, right? Asian people, Indigenous people, BIPOC people, biracial, right? Like all those realities are so sacred. And I think that that means that we have to move in ways that make that choice. And more important than anything, that put people in a position that they are willing to dedicate resources so that other people can make that choice, right? Because without that equity work, without an actual distribution of resources or restructured systems, is just performative, right? Like you can have as many equity conversations as you would like in your grad school class, right? You can have as many conversations as you would like at an academic level, 100%. But at the end of the day, are you willing to cut a check? At the end of the day, are you willing to restructure a system, create a scholarship, offer more acceptances to BIPOC people, right? And more importantly, especially because I know that the field of higher education, especially in education, is dominated by white people, we have to be very honest with the white people who work in educational systems, especially at the higher educational level. What spaces are you willing to give up, right? What conferences are you not willing to go to? What journals are you not willing to be published in? What are you willing to give up, right? The problem that we get into with white supremacy and racism and anti-racism work is everybody has the question of, you know, what do white people do with their privilege? Here's what white people can do with their privilege. Donate to this, go to this, look at that, right? Like, it's not a conversation about what white people need to do with their privilege, because if we are centering what white people do in the service of an anti-racist reality, that still centers whiteness as the most powerful group, right? And I think we had to be willing to have the conversation of, it's not a conversation of what are you willing to do with your privilege, but what privileges are you willing to give up, right? And that's the conversations that we need to invite people towards. That I have plenty of conversations with a lot of people that don't agree with me, some people that do, right? But all that to say that, like, we have to give a fuck. And more importantly than giving a fuck, you have to give a fuck enough to cut a check and show up, right? Because you can't get it on if you're not there. And you can't get it on if you don't give a damn. And so I think that kind of rounds out like the the moving pieces of how I understood about how people invested in me. And I think I get the opportunity to invest in people now too.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. And yeah, I mean, I got so many wheels turning right now. Just yeah, it's great. The last little piece, and you've touched on it here and there, but I'd love to, and I don't want to keep you too long, but I think this is kind of a good coup de grace of the final question is we've touched a lot this semester on the history of the frustratingly slow pace that things change in our society, and within that, what role the idea of resisting the dominant narrative or the current status quo, that idea of resistance. So I'd like to see if that resonates with you at all in your history of your social justice work, or the current present moment of what you're doing, or the future of what you want to impart to your students.
Yeah, I'm getting a little confused. Can you ask me the first part of the question again?
So yeah, this a theme of resistance, the theme of
resistance. I got it. Resistance. That's the keyword I needed. Oh man. You know, I was 19 years old. My first tattoo before I had all this, right? My first tattoo is actually right here, bro. And it says the word revolution. Right. And I think deeply, I got the word revolution on one arm, and on the other arm, it's lost in the sauce here now, but it says revelation. Right. And I got both words for a very specific reason, right? I believe that revolution, you know, on one side of my body is the supreme culmination of an action, right? It is the most powerful thing that any group of people could ever do together, right? Is create a revolution, whether it's technological, political, social, whatever it is, right? And then, which by the way, we need every kind of revolution possible. And then, you know, I got the word revelation because I believe revelation is the supreme culmination of thought, right? And I want to be the balance of both. I want to be the supreme culminations of thought and action, and how we do those things intentionally together. And I think it leads me to a very simple answer that I'll probably talk about for about 10 minutes. But if you're not resisting, then what are we doing? Right? It's why I think I don't use the word anti-racist anymore. I use the word decolonial, because if you're not decolonial, what are you? Right? And we have to be very honest, and we have to say it. We have to say that shit exactly like we mean it. Right? I'm not interested in holding people's feelings in regard to, you know, what they feel or what they'd like to feel. Right? I'm not interested in making white people feel comfortable in the service of what I think is important to brown and black resistance. Right? That's not my center. That's not what I'm invested in. That's not what I'm dedicated. That's not what I'm a dedicated labor to. Right? That's just not where I'm at. And I do think, you know, I speak for myself and only myself, but I do know that when it comes to resistance, it's also important to acknowledge that resistance is about disruption. That, like, you can't call resistance reading a book that made you uncomfortable, right? We can't call resistance, you know, donating to a black organization, right? Like, we have to have a conversation that resistance is about disruption, and that if you're not disrupting, then what you're doing is self-masturbatory action and performance of what you would like that action to be, right? That we have to be willing to disrupt, and that means that it's going to be uncomfortable, right? What I say about anti-racist work is that if racism is inherently uncomfortable, anti-racism has to be inherently uncomfortable too. And if it's not uncomfortable, then we're not pushing hard enough, right? If we feel like we're in a good spot, we're not, right? Because I think that anti-racist work, anti-misogynist work, decolonial work, all of it is supposed to put us in a tense position that gives us space and willingness and affirmation to disrupt, because without it, right, systems of society continue and persist, right? That, like, I think it's important to be clear about that shit. No, and don't get me wrong, right? I'm not saying that everybody has to get out in the streets and, you know, do all whatever they need to do. But I do think that, again, revolution is not everybody in the streets. Revolution is everybody thinking. And that means that we have to move in ways that affirm the ways that everybody can think towards revolution and independence, right? And more importantly, so they can apply their thoughts in disruptive ways. Because if we don't give people space to do that, all we're doing is winding their gears up, and we're not giving them anywhere to go, right? It's Paulo Freire's idea of, it's not enough to have practice, you need praxis, right? The critical pedagogy notion of why relevant world-based praxis is more important than whatever you could do, right? You might be a goddamn you might have read every fucking book in the goddamn world, right? But tell me what the fuck you done, right? What have you disrupted, right? John Brown has this amazing interview where he's talking with the racist segregationist governor of Alabama, and he's talking, and the governor of Alabama is saying, no, I love black people, right? I you know, he's a segregationist, but he's saying, I've done so much for black people. And John Brown looks at him, John Brown, the man that the Cleveland Browns are named after, looks at him and says, well, how many white people are upset with you? How many white friends have you lost for how much you've done for black people? Right? And I think that's the conversation we need to get to, right? It's about disruption. And listen, disruption looks different for everybody. Protests aren't even the most accessible thing. What do we do for disabled folks, right? What do we do for, you know, all these different realities that exist, the social and political and economic capital you have to be able to take a day off work and go to a protest in the first place, right? Like, that's a big conversation that we can't have, because we're understanding that, like, even when we go to a protest, we're going to be guided, right? If the police are setting your entire trajectory for your protest, that's a parade. That's not a protest, right? Protesting, activism, resistance are about disruption, right? And that means that you have to be committed to every disruption possible. And that's not to say that, you know, one is more valuable than the other. Everybody has a front line. You feel me? I'm a teacher. That's my front line. I'll be disrupting every day, right? That's where I hold it down, right? My girl, I love her to death. She works in tech, and she has a very different front line in diversifying tech and doing very different things than I do. But I know that she's resisting just like I am. I know she's disrupting just like I am. I know that she's working towards the same reality I am, because there are so many different front lines. I mentioned earlier that the average age of a Latinx person in the United States is 11 years old. That does not mean I want all my kids to be teachers, right? I want them to be plumbers and carpenters and teachers, sure, and maybe a politician, and maybe a Whole Foods worker, and maybe a gas station clerk, right? Like, everybody's going to have a different front line. What that means is we have to awake people of how are you going to disrupt on yours, right? What are you willing to make people uncomfortable about? What are you willing to change? What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to move around in the sake of what you are talking about, right? Like, I think that's where we need to get in that conversation. I think if I could impart anything on my future students, is that that's all I ever want to do. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in being, the greatest teacher in the world, right? I'm interested in giving my I'm not interested in liberating my students. I'm interested in my students liberating themselves. And that means I have to give them the opportunity and the reality that they can take in that choice, right? Because if we're talking about, listen, I tell all of them, you need to go to college and you have to apply to college as part of my, what is that doing? What is that doing? That's putting all of them on the same front line. And they might go different places for sure, but is that even safe for my students in the first place? I think about the ways that whiteness tore at me for a really long time, being in a predominantly white environment. Is that safe for all my students? Is that safe for my Black trans students to tell them that they have to go to college to be able to think about these things and all this stuff? The reason we also have to have the other side of that conversation is inherently an academic world that thrives off being inaccessible. Like, it's not consequential that academics are inaccessible, right? Or academic jargon or language or all this kinds of stuff is inaccessible. It's that it's intentionally done so a small group of people can talk about what it means, right? I wrote an article on Medium where I said, look, right, when we talk, during Black Lives Matter, everybody had all these really abstract and giant words for what racism meant and all this kinds of stuff, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge the idea that Black people already know, right? You could paint Sistine Chapels on the ceiling about what you think racism operates like. People know, right? All you're doing is you're using language to mimic a group of people that are not interested in giving up space towards liberation because they would not have a role without it, right? That's why Angela Davis says the quote of the revolution is not going to happen in the academics. It's going to happen in the hood where it's accessible, which also comes to the conversation of it's not just about disruption, but it's about accessibility. If what you're doing, the disruption that you're causing from your own front line, right, from your own unique reality, your own social condition and reality, is that accessible to other people? Can other people learn about it? Can other people experience it? Can other people share it? Can other people help you in it? Can other people take it and build it in a different way, right? I think we also have to have a very honest conversation about how capitalism in revolutions has created this idea of how people own things in a revolution. Nobody owns anything in a revolution. Not words, not ideas, right? Not movements, not protests, right? I'm not interested in one person's protest and them claiming a protest. That's the problem with a lot of social media and like capitalism activism, is we are now glorifying individual activists for large movements. And that means that, like, however you feel about that, that's on you, bro, right? Like, I'm interested, right, in mutual ownership of everything, right? Not necessarily towards communism, that's a whole different conversation, but a mutual ownership of a movement, right? When I go to your protest, that's my protest too. When you come to mine, that's your protest too, right? When I give you an idea and I give you a book, that's not because it's mine, that's because it's yours too. That when I start to own things and I start to say, no, this is mine, no, this is what we're doing, no, you didn't do this, I did, we're enforcing the same colonial gatekeeping boundaries that created the realities we're resisting against in the first place. That's how we have to come about when we talk about resistance, right? And more importantly, right, if we're talking about individual activism, right, we might have had the best damn active, we might have had the new Martin Luther King Jr., right, walking through our streets, doing all that kinds of stuff. But when we glorify just Martin Luther King Jr., right, what do we do? We follow the same systems, right? The same consequential realities, and that's not disruptive. That's not disruptive to have one person doing one thing and claiming one ownership over one idea, right? Like, that's capitalism. That's the same thing that already happens. The individualist shit that fucks us up in the first place, right? That's the same thing, and that's not disruptive either, right? What's disruptive is collectivism. What's disruptive is in la cash. What's disruptive is Ubuntu. There's so many words in all kinds of languages about it, right? What's disruptive is a collective of people committing to thinking, and what's disruptive is a collective of people committing to acting in the service of each other, not of themselves.
Yeah. Without words. No, that's, I mean, I'm not going to center this around me or even around you, but this is another one, and hopefully a chorus of voices that that are going to send forth the same message, and and really push that thinking that you've talked about. So I really just want to thank you for your energy and for sitting here tonight to participate with me, and assure you that that thinking will continue with what you
Cool.
said. So we'll
Yeah.
go ahead
Well,
and
well, listen, man, thank you for having me. I'm sorry. I know I got a tendency to talk, bro, but I appreciate you giving me some space.
no, it's great. And that's what it's about, is having the space to do that. So
For sure.
yeah, I don't think I could have thought of, or I could have conceived a better outcome for this project. So I really appreciate that. And hopefully we can connect again in the future and keep the
Yeah,
conversation.
man. Send me a copy of the project or something. I'd love to read it, man.
Yeah, I'll definitely update you on the results.
For sure. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate you.
All right, take care. Have a good night.
You too.